Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Virtuality Podcast. I'm Neil Gupta from Boston AR.
And I'm Craig Herndon from Boston VR.
Today, we're talking with Rachel Sibley from Leap Motion, so let's dive right in.
Hey, Rachel, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So the first question we want to open up with is, what does Leap Motion do? And then what about your background brought you to Leap Motion?
So at Leap Motion, we work to bridge the boundaries between humans and computers by changing the way that human beings interact with computers. So if you look at the history of human-computer interaction, you see while processing power has increased exponentially, human-computer interaction has not increased exponentially. It's actually very linear in nature. So you go from the punch card of the IBM days where the card is either punched or not punched, to the keyboard where the key is either pushed or not pushed, to the mouse where the mouse is either clicked or not clicked. And now with the touchscreen, we have new versions of pushing and not pushing. And you've got some swipe, but fundamentally you have very binary interactions. And we see that as a major bottleneck in the way that human beings access, understand, and manipulate information and knowledge. This shows up in a lot of ways. So you'll see, for example, professional designers, if we have any of those that are listening, they'll be very familiar with CAD and mocking up three-dimensional objects in essentially two-dimensional surfaces and having to point and click and drag in order to rotate that object. And yet, what we see is that despite the fact that these designers are incredibly well trained, very intelligent, equipped with very powerful software, it can take you an hour to design a mug in this software, where if you give a 5-year-old a hunk of clay, they can mold a mug in 5 minutes. And so we look at that and we see a problem that we could be solving by making it possible for people to interact with information and knowledge in rich, nuanced, and subtle ways. Specifically, making it possible for people to interact with digital information in spatial computing the same way that they do in the real world. So you can essentially reach out and interact with objects in virtual or augmented reality the same way you would in your everyday reality, using an input mechanism that is highly complex, advanced, and intuitive for every single human being on the planet, the human hand.
Very cool. Very cool. And do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that you're doing at Leap Motion and how your background brought you to that point?
Sure. So I have a somewhat wayward path. I have essentially followed my passions and decided that I was going to make my market differentiator the sum total of my interests, not a segmentation of my skill set. And so I was a professional choreographer and dancer for a time. I was deep in design thinking as a member of the core team at IBM Design who led out design thinking globally across that company. And I almost went to med school at one point because I'm deeply interested in human cognition and how the brain and the body work. And so all of those things highlight a core fascination of mine, which is the way that we understand information and knowledge and the way that we can leverage our human biological system in order to do that more accurately, in a way that creates more meaning or allows us to synthesize information more fully. And that is essentially the core interest that brought me to Leap Motion. So at Leap Motion, I lead our go-to-market strategy, and I do a lot of speaking and events and some business development. So I help to chart the course of where we're headed and to support our very talented teams in building out some deeply fascinating technology. And we can get into the nitty-gritty of how that technology works in a minute if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, we'd love to dive into that and learn more about it. So Craig, I don't know if you want to take the next question.
Yeah. So before going deep in, so how do you feel that your personal experiences, the things like dancing, are helping you shape how you think of augmented virtual reality, and just kind of more how your personal experiences are directly influencing the way you're thinking about it?
Do you want
Absolutely. I really appreciate you asking this question. So based on my experience as a kinesthete, I'll say, because it's more than just being a dancer, I would also identify with being an embodied learner, meaning I learn best through doing and through hands-on interaction. And in being a person who experiences the world highly kinesthetically and learns best immersively, I have always thought deeply about what it means to use your body as an interface, whether I'm teaching people how to do social dance or creating a piece of choreography with some narrative meaning, or growing up inside the Montessori classrooms of the school that my parents founded. And Montessori education has this edict: I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And I was definitely inculcated with that model for understanding the world. And so one of the things that I've always brought with me is I think it's very strange how we often separate the brain from the body. And we tend to think of we have to be analytical. We shouldn't let our emotions muddy the picture. And yet, in my experience, I find that integrating our kinesthetic and emotive awareness with our analytical insights is where we get the most interesting insights, especially in the kind of work that I'm engaged with. And so I think a lot about how using our bodies shapes our thinking. And this is now something that cognitive science is exploring in depth. And so you can explore this in the fields of embodied cognition and inactive cognition, both of which essentially state that we, in the form of embodied cognition, we think with our bodies, and in inactive cognition, we think with our movement. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we know as dancers is that we can abstract complex ideas physically in order to more effectively learn them, remember them. So we do a practice called marking when we're creating choreography, and when we're learning choreography, we will move through it and physicalize the abstract ideas without having to enact the full performance as a way to learn it and remember it. And you see a similar increase in knowledge retention in students whenever they are given the opportunity to do hands-on learning. So, for example, the National Science Foundation funded a VR demo that was focused on understanding the movement of tectonic plates. And when children were able to manipulate those tectonic plates themselves and watch the interactions in the space based on their own physical experience of the learning process, there was a 30% learning retention increase. And another interesting data point for that, on the other end of the life cycle, we learn in embodied ways very effectively as children, but we continue in that throughout our lives, and especially in our elder years. So one of the things that is now being researched is essentially retaining your episodic memory. So let me explore that a bit. As we age, we actually lose our ability to remember our personalized experiences, our first-person experiences. Those of us who are close with our grandparents have probably witnessed this. And what we've seen is that people actually lose their episodic memory as they lose their ability to move around in a space. And yet, if you reverse that process, if you can put a person who is losing their episodic memory into a space where they suddenly regain their range of motion, their episodic memory increases. So, for example, if you put a group of the elderly in a virtual world and have them go on a computer-generated tour of the space, a passive tour, they remember certain things about the space, but they don't remember nearly as much as they would if they were to navigate it themselves. So if you put a group of elderly individuals through a tour of a space where they get to guide themselves and they have ownership of their own movement, they actually retain those memories more deeply. And that's an example of inactive cognition, where our memory is actually physically coded. So these are two zones that I think are very interesting in terms of the impact of technology, and specifically this technology, this virtual reality and augmented reality, this world of spatial computing that we're all working in, to transform the way that we learn, the way that we remember our experiences, and solve some fundamental human problems.
So when you talk about the way that we can engage our own memories in spatial computing, or by being spatially active in these memories, so what was sort of the terminology you were using, like that sort of spatial engagement with people's memories?
Well, you can think of it as inactive cognition or embodied cognition.
Gotcha. Okay.
And episodic memory is what people lose when they're using one form or another. But if you just want to say, how does it transform our ability to learn and remember, depending on the way that we're engaging with that space?
Sure. So when you talk about all of these things, I'm curious how the medium changes our ability to learn and remember based on what the experience is. So can you talk a little bit about, within spatial computing, you've got maybe 360 headsets and 360 cameras and 360 photos. You've got interactive VR content with some of the controllers that are out there now. And then you've got the Leap Motion controller that provides true fidelity and high fidelity of your exact motions of your hands. Is there a difference between those when you talk about how people are learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's an important question for all of us to ask as specifically content creators in this space, because this technology is interesting, fascinating, exciting. But if we don't create meaningful content experiences, it won't go anywhere. It won't solve real problems. And that's, at the end of the day, what I think we're all here to do, to create meaningful human experiences and solve real human problems. And in order to do that, you have to think very deeply about the use case and the problem set. So these different domains, whether it's a 360 headset or an interactive VR experience, are suited to different things. And my interest converges around interactive VR. And I'll tell you why. I think that one of the biggest zones of promise of VR, many of us believe this, is its ability to evoke presence, its ability to transform a person's perception of themselves and the space around them and give them access to ideas, experiences, and knowledge and information that they wouldn't already have had. And one of the things that makes that truly occur is having your physical body there with you in the space. This is not a new idea. We've known about this for decades. When veterans returned from war missing a limb, we noticed that you could do mirror therapy. You could allow a veteran who was missing a limb to unclench a phantom fist where they were experiencing phantom pain from their missing limb by having them place their existing hand on a table, putting a mirror in the middle of the table, and tricking their brain with visual stimuli into believing there was, in fact, a hand where their missing hand was once upon a time. And in that way, they could actually heal pain for these people who are missing limbs. And the same thing occurs in virtual reality when you see a digital rendering of your hand in the virtual space. You experience the very well documented phenomenon of body transfer. And that really is, in my opinion, the magic that Leap Motion provides to the people who use it, is you're able to interact not only in a way that is natural and accessible, but also that deeply instills a sense of presence because you brought your physical body with you into the digital space in a way that you immediately relate to.
This might be sort of something for after the show, but I feel like when I have these conversations with people in VR, AR, a lot of these things get said, and I guess it'd be great to just have a way for people to go back and actually read this documentation and read the studies. So if you have any places you'd recommend people to start reading on these types of phenomenons or research, because I know during your talk you had mentioned some at AWE, but I don't know if you have any offhand or if you can send some articles later that we can put in the podcast.
I would be happy to do that. I will send you them. I was looking on my Twitter feed right now. But essentially, if you want to keep abreast of these things, I'm always tweeting them because, like you, I want to create more visibility around this knowledge. And so that's one place you can go to @SibleySpeaks. I will also send you a link to 2 of the studies that I referenced earlier, specifically the one about episodic memory.
Great. Yeah, we can put those in the show notes that way.
So do you think the technology is limiting us from having certain experiences right now? And is there a direction that Leap Motion's going to try and, attack a use case that we can't currently solve right now?
What we are focused on is transforming human-computer interaction in a way that opens up our ability to interact with information and knowledge. We do that with really solid hand tracking and really innovating in essentially user experience design. And one of the core pieces here that I think is relevant and important for us to discuss is interaction engines. So, for example, you could have the world's most perfect hand tracking, and it would mean absolutely nothing if you can't interact with a digital object in a way that feels real, that feels natural. And why is that? That's because digital objects obviously have no mass and no force. You have to actually code physics into the space in order for you to be able to reach out and grab a digital object and have it replicate your natural lived experience. And so we've actually done that at Leap Motion and made that available to everyone, whether they use Leap Motion or not. It supports controllers as well. And we want to innovate in good user experience in order to translate human intention consistently and accurately, because we believe that the best technology is technology that essentially disappears.
Right. And I think what you're getting at here is just the progression of human-computer action being linear. So what do you think VR developers need to do right now to create a new type of interface? What are some certain tips they can do? What are things to stay away from? Like what is a bad design? Let's start there.
Yeah. So it really depends on your use case. If you are trying to create a narrative experience, you are going to have to let go of some amount of immersion. This is something I often highlight to people. There's almost this inverse relationship between deep presence and narrative control. What I see people do is they'll create this incredibly beautiful virtual world, and then they'll be confused when their users drop in and they're distracted looking at the caterpillar on the leaf, and they've lost the first 3 minutes of the narration that the creator was trying to get them hooked into. So that's something relatively simple that I often encourage people to think about. You need to understand how you are defining your user's mask from the get-go. Are they a voyeur? Are they an active participant? Are they a godlike entity in the space? And when you think really deeply about your user mask and use that to inform the design of your creation, you are much better equipped to create an experience that will have the intended effect when you let someone loose inside it in a virtual world.
Very cool. So that, what you're describing there are really, it's clear that you come from this design background, right? This user-centered perspective of what is your user's goal or function, or what is it that they're trying to experience and do? And if you can understand that, how can you now provide that to them?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Cool. So I think, we started to talk about it a little bit, but I'd love to get your perspective on when you talk about making these more accurate gestures or more specific gestures or interactions, how is that done from a technical perspective, right? So how do you quantify what it feels like to, catch a rubber ball versus to put your hand on a brick wall versus to pop a balloon or something like that?
Yeah, it's a really hard and important question to solve. And that's essentially what we've done with the Interaction Engine V1 release. Essentially, we created a way to make it easy to create physical user experiences that work best in VR. So we essentially built a layer that exists between the Unity game engine and real-world hand physics to give developers access to unprecedented physical interfaces and interactions. So that includes not only complex object physics, but also wearable interfaces and even curved spaces, which is another very design-centric interaction innovation. Because if you think about spaces and UI in VR, we are prone to design linear cubic spaces, whereas what we find actually works best for your user are curved spaces. So if you take your arm and you stick it out right now and wave it around in front of you, you will realize that you are tracing arcs in the air. You are not tracing boxes. So your body really is built for curved UIs. If you are sort of pulling up a cockpit for a plane that you want to build into a virtual experience, or if you want to create a massive bookshelf of resources that people can grab, it's actually most effective to interact in that curved space. And so the graphic renderer is a brand new and interesting aspect of our new update that makes that possible.
And what is the name of the latest update? Is that Orion?
So this update is actually, it's the interaction engine, and it was released in June 2017. We released a beta version last year, which was really exciting to give people access to. What we see in this new full version release is, as I mentioned, the graphic renderer, which is not essentially a part of the interaction engine, but designed to pair tightly with it. And we've made the interaction engine itself much easier to use. It has a massively better workflow for devs and better core physics, for example, grabbing. It's also optimized for mobile VR.
So is a lot of the work with the emotion right now, do you think it's more focused on the software portion, like the interaction you're talking about? Or is it more on the hardware side, or are you developing both?
We do both. We are always focused on perfecting our hand tracking, and it really is the software that's sort of the magic in the equation. That said, hardware is also an important part, because in creating smaller form factors and mobile performant Leap Motion technology, we have to innovate on that side. We've also taken our hardware innovations as an opportunity to address some of the developer needs that have been highlighted to us by our community. For example, one of the things that we heard from our developer community over and over again was that the experience was breaking for people with really long arms. And that essentially becomes a field of view problem. And so we massively increased the field of view in the new mobile VR reference design to 180 degrees by 180 degrees.
Awesome. So if you don't have anything else to say on that, we have another question for you, which is, so earlier this year, Leap Motion announced a partnership with Qualcomm. Can you say anything about like why that was made and what you're planning to do with them?
Yes, that essentially was an early version of our vision for a complete mobile VR experience. So one of the things we are always trying to do is to push the ecosystem towards the optimal user experience in virtual reality. And what we believe has to happen in order for mass adoption to take place in VR and for it to solve meaningful human problems is a few things. One, we believe it needs to be on mobile, because with a tethered experience, while that is great for certain use cases, it is not as accessible to a broad market as mobile VR will be. So instead of having a market of tens of thousands, mobile opens up a market of millions and so many more use cases, whether it's a surgeon on the go being able to bring in a headset and show a patient their tumor in a three-dimensional way, or classrooms or scientists at NASA doing work to study the surface of Mars in different locations. All of those opportunities become much more feasible with mobile VR. So that's the first piece. It has to be mobile. Second, you have to resolve positional tracking. It is not acceptable for users to have essentially the experience of nausea in a virtual experience, because that means they will not come back to that virtual experience. And in order to solve that, you need to be able to have an all-in-one head tracking, positional tracking experience without external sensors if we want it to be truly mobile, truly portable for our users. And the third piece that we think is critical is natural interaction. We find that for many users, if you put them in VR, and especially if they're not gamers, if it's that broader market we were just discussing, using controllers and buttons that they can't even see to navigate the space is very challenging. That is why we think that having hands as the natural input paradigm is what will really help virtual reality take off in a bigger way. We think that as the basis for how we all already interact with the three-dimensional world, it makes sense for that to be the way that we interact with our virtual world. And we're certainly not opposed to there being tools. We are, as human beings, we do use tools. It's just that we want people to have a natural, rich, subtle, nuanced way to interact with the virtual world. So those three components were all essentially epitomized in the Qualcomm reference design. You had Qualcomm's positional tracking, leap motion hand tracking, all in a mobile form factor. And as we move forward, that form factor, of course, due to technological innovation, will get smaller and smaller. But that was really a key piece. And obviously working with a mobile giant like Qualcomm is a key step towards optimizing towards mobile platforms.
That was a great 3-point breakdown. Thank you very much. Actually, I've got one question.
All right.
This is just sort of a right.
Awesome.
Just, as someone who works at Leap Motion, I'm sure you've seen a lot of different applications of it. Just from sort of a more fun perspective, what's been your most fun experience that you've used the Leap Motion with?
That's a great question. I'm biased because as a dancer, I experience these things a little bit differently, I think. And I'll give you a data point for that. I was in a studio, a really well-known game studio in Austin, Texas. And I went in and I was talking with them about using Leap Motion. And the CEO pulled in all of his devs into the room and they put me through an experience that they hadn't released to the market yet. And while I was in the experience, I'd never tried it before. I heard the entire studio oohing and awing and responding. I was like, what is going on out there? And I'm not a traditional gamer, so I'm even more confused by like, what is their response about? And I take off the headset and they tell me, we have only seen 2 other people in our 50 user tests duck when arrows are shot at them or move behind a wall in order to escape. And they were astounded that I had done the natural thing, which is to move in my environment. And I think that reflects some of the biases that are inherent in this industry at present. A lot of our early users are people who are used to sitting still. And as a dancer, that's obviously not the bias that I have. And so I'm curious about that. I'm curious about how we can open up this space to people with different backgrounds and specifically more movement backgrounds, because I think if we are going to lay down the future of 3-dimensional spatial computing, which relies on movement, we do need some movement experts in the space to talk about that. And we need our developers to get into their bodies and understand that deeply, just as those developers had, designing for a fully embodied experience. But my favorite Leap Motion experiences reflect that. I find that it's fascinating to me to be able to inhabit a space and watch how my physical expression transforms the data that is coming back to me. And so one of my colleagues built an experience called Mirrors, which we often show at events, that is just beautiful. It's this simulation where your body becomes fire or confetti or all of these other things. And it is the intensity of the visual display is related to the speed of your movement. And so you're having this direct physical control over your visual experience at the same time. It's very beautiful.
That's so interesting. I would love to see sort of an fMRI of what's happening with all the neural connections as someone is doing that for the first time or even the 100th time.
Absolutely. One of the things that's been really interesting to me is to watch people from really different backgrounds try it out. So, we had a 7-year-old whose father runs a VR studio at South by Southwest try it out. And he was giving us better user feedback than most people do. It was so interesting to me. I'm fascinated endlessly by how this technology opens up computing in ways that we haven't yet understood. Because a 7-year-old, for example, they have all the things they need to know about interacting with a 3-dimensional world, much more so than they do interacting with a 2-dimensional world. All of us had to sit through school and learn how to type or how to write if you're in our grandparents' generation in order to interact with information and knowledge in a 2-dimensional way. And what if we could break that paradigm apart and make that possible for students, skip over some of those other interaction paradigms? I'm fascinated by that. I would love to see a VR experience that coded the laws of quantum physics and then made that available to K through 12 students so that they could have an embodied understanding of quantum physics. Because right now, the only people who get to understand quantum physics are people who are really adept at abstract thinking. If you think about Newtonian physics, most people understand it because we all have an embodied reference point for what it means to throw a ball and see it move in a parabola. So we all have these basic kinesthetically anchored understandings of knowledge in that domain. We don't have it for domains like astrophysics or quantum physics, but we could. We can now build those experiences. And if we can make that knowledge accessible to people, those people will then be able to solve all new kinds of problems.
So I have a bit of a counterpoint to you saying that they have everything they need. So I have a game studio called Digital Precept, and we've had over 2,000 people play our game Kung Fu Shadow Fist at this point. And to start the game, we have an arcade machine with a coin on it. And when we've had like 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, even as old as like 12, that have no idea what to do because they've never seen an arcade machine before in their life. So
that is beautiful. Well, and you're highlighting a really important design decision, right? You have to know your user. Is your user going to have the cultural and socio-historical reference points for the experience you're creating? And if it's an anachronistic experience for them, absolutely not. They didn't live to see arcade. But what I mean is they have they've been born with the ability to interact with three-dimensional spaces. That's our fundamental way of coming to know the world. We reach out and we touch things. Then we put them in our mouths. I don't think we're going to do that. I hope we're not going to do that. Maybe we will. But I love your point, though. And I think it highlights an important design decision.
Yeah. But I think if instead of putting things in our mouth, I think we're at the stage where we grab things and we throw things is what I've seen people do.
Yes, we do. We want to understand physics in this new world. And, there's a lot to explore here still. We need studies about how being in a virtual world affects brain development. We need studies about how looking at virtual screens for hours at a time can affect vision. We don't have these things yet. And so I want to also interject that before I say, let's roll this out through all K through 12 classrooms. There's a lot of important work to be done to understand this technology, and I think it is being done from what I see in universities. I'm seeing these questions be asked, but I want to encourage us to keep asking those questions so that we can equip ourselves to leverage this technology with as many positive intended consequences and avoid our unintended negative consequences, which we know will always follow us. So it requires that mindfulness as we move through the process.
Well said. I agree. Mindfulness is key. And as a kinesthetic that you are, you would know that, people can interpret the world very differently. So even if we say, oh, this is a better model for learning, there's still going to be a lot of kind of customization to how the individual learns within that.
Correct. And you can even look at it in terms of special interest communities. Special interest is probably a weird way to put it, but you can look at that in terms of smaller user groups. So for example, one of the groups that I would not have thought would be so deeply drawn to Leap Motion's technology are children with autism. We have found just organically so much interest in that sector. I've had countless parents send me emails and tell me how their autistic child is able to engage with the Leap Motion controller and learn things in a way that they've never been able to get them to do otherwise. And that's an area that is fascinating to me. I haven't deep dived into that because I, to be frank, haven't had the time to look into that and explore it. But those are the kinds of things that I'm seeing emerge. And it's just such an open space of opportunity. There are so many things like that that require inquisitive minds to go after them and understand them and then create some meaningful insights and outcomes based on what they observe.
So there is one more question I wanted to ask you. When Barrett Fox was at Boston VR, he mentioned that skeuomorphism does not equal dimensionality, and was hoping you could kind of elaborate on what that means.
Absolutely. So in the context of interaction history, skeuomorphism was one of the core ways that we helped people understand how to go from three-dimensional interaction, our lived world to two-dimensional interaction on a desktop computer screen. So early GUIs relied on skeuomorphic three-dimensional elements like buttons that appeared to compress when clicked. So the user in 1992 needed that three-dimensional effect on buttons to understand that they were meant to be pressed, just like buttons on other media like radios and TVs. And over time, those faded away in favor of color state changes, affecting flat design aesthetics. So, now people will look in the operating systems and they'll see that active and passive states are communicated entirely through color state, not by a drop shade. But the irony there is that the flat skeuomorphic spectrum is just another form of flat thinking. And so essentially, what we need to think about in virtual reality is what are the cues that communicate structure and relationships between different UI elements? That's really the core question here. And this actually brings us back to the interaction engine, because one of my favorite aspects of the interaction engine are the wearable interfaces and widgets. So we ask the question, not only how do people interact with the virtual world in a physical way, i.e. what happens when you grasp an object? What does it feel like to naturally grab and release a virtual object? What about contact when a user passes their hand through an object, like picking up your hand, pushing it through blocks and having it go through the table? That wouldn't happen in real life. So what should happen in the virtual world? But also, the other big piece there is not just about interaction with virtual objects, but also interaction with interfaces. And so in VR, we can augment our digital selves with new capabilities and essentially give ourselves virtual wearable interfaces, an interface that is worn on the hand, that expands into freestanding palettes as the user grabs an element off the hand and tosses it out into the world. You were referencing earlier how we now, take objects and grab them and throw them in VR. And that's something that we explored in our wearable interface package, which is a companion to the interaction engine. So essentially, we have made it possible to just make it really easy to build an interface from your hand and then throw it and spawn out a freestanding interface that could be an artist's palette or an engineer's toolkit or a data scientist's control panel. So those are all created so that the user can understand how to interact with those buttons, knobs, widgets, etc. And I encourage everyone to go check it out. It's a free download. Just go play with it and send us your feedback, because we always want to make them better.
And is this just leapmotion.com and assume downloads?
You got it. Just come check out our website.
Awesome. And we can put that in the show notes as well. So if anyone wants to check it out, all the links should be right there.
Wonderful.
Great. So, Rachel, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you and learning a little bit about what Leap Motion is doing and how there's so much more than just a little device that can monitor what your hands are doing. There's a huge ecosystem that you're really building and that you're a part of. And it seems like the whole company is thinking about the ecosystem in a much deeper way than just the piece of hardware that maybe people have been exposed to so far.
Thank you guys for having me. It was lovely giving a talk at the Boston VR meetup, and we really appreciated getting to interact with your community. It's vibrant and thriving. It's really, really top notch. So we really appreciate you guys inviting us to be a part of it.
Yep, no problem at all. You're welcome to come to Boston VR anytime. So I'm Craig Herndon.
And I'm Neil Gupta.
And we'll see you in this reality.
Or the next.
Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, Virtuality.show.